Hi, students, and welcome to Lecture 2 and Principles of Ecology, Nature 270. I hope you're enjoying the class so far, and I especially hope that each of you are finding ways to be safe and healthy during this very unusual occurrence that we're experiencing right now with COVID-19. Please be sure and check in with me as this course continues. I would love to hear from you. My office hours are being accomplished through Google Hangouts. That is an opportunity for you to check in each week if you have any questions. The way you access that is make sure you have Google Calendar installed on your phone or your laptop. You will get an invitation in your calendar from me. And when you click on that invitation, it will bring you into the Hangout room. Those are every Tuesday and Wednesday, or if those times don't work for you, let me know and we can set something up by appointment. Today's lecture is one of my favorite in the series that we have this quarter because it is dealing with marine and freshwater environments. So as I go through this content today, I get really excited about it and I sometimes will just jump ahead. So if at any time this is confusing or I cover something too quickly, please do avail yourself of that opportunity to hang out, not only with myself, but our whole class can join in and we'll have an opportunity to communicate that way. Also, this lecture is loaded up under a YouTube tab in Schoology. When you download that and open that up, you're going to see it's kind of in a Facebook format, which allows you to type a note. Please do that. That's how I'm keeping track of attendance each week. So after you watch a lecture, just send a little note there that says, "Hey, Georgia, I watched this today," and I'll count that for your attendance. Today, we get right up here on our intro screen. I've changed this lecture a little bit and I'll upload the latest version of it in the PowerPoint section. Sometimes as I move through, YouTube videos that I used one year don't work the subsequent year, and I'll re-upload those as I get it changed. So as we go into lecture 2, life in water, life in the oceans, I would like you to pause for a moment and think about the bias in that statement. Humans are terrestrial organisms. If you're a wildlife and fisheries major, your focus is largely on terrestrial habitats. And if you look at the names for places, locations, and even our sciences, they're heavily influenced by this terrestrial bias that we have. Today's lecture is important for many reasons because it forces us to stop and look at our planet and recognize how rare and wonderful it is in the universe, and in our solar system in particular. We're the only location for liquid water. We can find water on some of the moons of Jupiter, for instance. Ganymede, we think, has frozen water below a very, very thick ice layer. But liquid moving water is unique to planet Earth, and it is so critical to every living thing on the planet. It's kind of interesting that most of our names for where we live and for studies are based on things like Terra, Logos, Geos, uh, terrestrial bias names. As I hope by the time we get through today's lecture, you'll have a greater appreciation for just how critical fresh and marine water environments are to all habitats on the planet. So let's take a look. Our 4 C's, I always like to start with those in each lecture. Uh, Cultural understanding will be touched on in a few places in today's lecture. I always encourage my students to be good citizens in their community, but most importantly, be a good citizen to yourself. Take good care of yourself. I hope each of you are able to practice good self-isolating social distancing practices right now, and that you're finding ways to just take really good care of yourself during this quarter. Critical thinking. For this lecture, we're going to be covering a lot of habitats and concepts that may be new to you, especially if you grew up as I did in a landlocked area. But also, after today's lecture, I encourage you in the tab that says YouTube videos, when you open that up, you're going to see additional links. And at the end of every lecture, I am creating some more opportunities for you to go a little deeper with the concepts we have. I'm using a bit of software called PlayPosit, and I'm taking YouTube and other video sources and encouraging you to engage with those sources. Take a look and answer the questions. There'll be two today, one on the Bay of Fundy. It's a remarkable place. If you've never heard of this bay, it's up near Nova Scotia, has the largest wave and tidal actions of anywhere on the planet. So make sure you engage with that. Secondly, your text does a really good job of giving you some examples of how to engage with ecological statistics. So I have also uploaded a play pause it video for you to play around with that a little bit. Normally we would do that in class. Obviously we can't do that this quarter. So take a moment, engage with that. It will help you, especially as Dr. Frizzell is going to introduce you to these statistical procedures in the labs every Friday. So make sure you revisit stats, take a look at Play Posit on that and engage with those. For communication, again, I just want to encourage you, call, email, text with myself, with Dr. Frizzell, and with each other. We can do that through Google Hangouts, and I really hope that you take advantage of that. Okay, so what's on our list for today? Well, in today's lecture, we are going to be looking at the hydrologic cycle, something that I'm sure each of you has touched on since high school. If you had my Intro to Zoo class, if you've taken my fisheries class, Intro to Fish and Wildlife class, we always start there. You cannot study ecosystems if you don't understand the hydrologic cycle. So we're going to talk about that again today. We're also going to talk about shallow marine habitats, estuaries, salt marshes, and mangroves. Those latter ones, a lot of books will kind of address those like they're a soup to nuts category. I'm going to give them a little more attention because they deserve it. There are so many species of both plants and animals that depend on those habitats, and we're losing them. So I want to give them the attention they deserve because they need conservation and they need more awareness in order to protect them. Okay, so on page 47 of your text, if you are following along in your book, I invite you to look at that while I'm lecturing to you today. It gives you the breakdown on the hydrologic cycle. How long does it take a molecule of water to move from the atmosphere to a lake? And how long does it stay in a lake? Or how long does it take it to move through an ocean environment and come back up to the surface and go through evaporation, condensation, and precipitation again? What you find are these rates are incredibly variable depending on the location on the planet, depending upon the type of precipitation and condensation event. Basically, the hydrologic cycle moves water around, and that works planet-wide, but the rate at which that goes is incredibly variable. So if we look at that rate, we're really looking at turnover time. How long does it take a molecule of water to move through groundwater? Well, that can be measured in thousands and thousands of years. Once water drops onto a land surface and seeps down into an aquifer, it can be there for millennia. The largest lake on planet Earth cannot be seen. It's Lake Vostok, and that lake is underneath huge, huge ice sheets in Antarctica. That water that is within Lake Vostok is considered some of the oldest lake water on the planet and also some of the most pristine. That water has been there for some limnologists, people who study lakes. They think it's been over there or down there for over 10,000 years. That's amazing. Compare that to Flathead Lake. Water that moves into Flathead Lake, even though it's a very, very big water body, will likely turn over within 3 years. That's incredibly fast, but that occurs because Flathead Lake is controlled by a dam on the north, Hungry Horse on the south, Energy Keepers, and it's got a current that's moving it around at the same time, which causes it to have a rather rapid turnover rate. What do I want you to know about this? Likely on an exam or a homework question, I just want you to understand that turnover rates within the hydrologic cycle are very different when you compare groundwater to surface water to marine or ocean water. Again, imagine a water molecule at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. That water is going to be there for thousands of years before it ever makes it back up to the surface and back into the atmosphere. How does it get there? How does it move? Why doesn't gravity just keep water on the bottom of the ocean? That's part of what we're studying today in Lecture 2. Again, if you are following along in your text, on page 48, we have figure 3.5. I'm looking at my text as well. We have this map of ocean currents. Now, ocean currents are a cornerstone of oceanography, a class that I wish we had here at SKC. Ocean currents govern everything, and they often do not get the press they deserve, especially when you're in a landlocked state like Montana. Ocean currents drive weather, they drive water movement, they move nutrients and nutrition around the globe, they move fish and other species around all over the earth, and they also move culture. If you look at these ocean currents, in particular, look at the ocean current that cycles from Europe to North America. If you take a look at that, you see not only the current pattern, but you see the Coriolis effect in place, which is created by the rotation of the Earth, which means if you were to get into a ship in Spain and set out, even without an engine, just under wind power, that ship is going to be directed to southern coastlines in both Central and North America. So why do I spend time on this? This isn't part of ecology, but it is part of culture. Think about how colonialism was affected by ocean currents. One could argue that colonialism in North America might have been reversed if those ocean currents went in the opposite direction. Something to consider. That's more of a question for philosophy, but it's something that I think we need to talk about, especially in today's climate, where climate change is changing the not only temperature of the water, but current path. So here's your question. As I mentioned in the first lecture, if you've not had me as an instructor before, in each of my lectures, I embed pause and reflect moments, moments for you to have metacognition, to think about your thinking. So you know what the hydrologic cycle is. We know that the Earth rotates. Let's put those two things together. Would the hydrologic cycle, in your opinion, function if the Earth did not rotate? Think about that. I encourage you to engage with these questions to deepen your understanding of how these two processes work together. If you can't come up with an answer, go on to YouTube. And I have a video coming up in just a moment that will touch on this thought. So here on slide 8, there is a 6-minute YouTube video. Now, if you've downloaded my PowerPoints, if you do that and you click here, nothing will happen. If you're downloading the PowerPoint, you're going to need to copy this address into the YouTube search engine to get to this video. If you're just following along with me in the recorded video, that's not a problem. But this is a NASA video. It's about 6 minutes, and it talks about this relationship between Earth's rotation, climate, and current. Typically, when I turn on a video for you, I step away so that your attention can be entirely on the video. So in about 6 minutes, I'll rejoin you after I get this queued up and ready to play. Get the volume up just a little bit here for you.
Thunderstorms are occurrence in the tropics. Some of these may become organized into large rotating systems with strong winds rolling into tropical storms or hurricanes. Tropical ocean basins like the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, retain substantial making these regions natural harbors for by extracting carbon storms have become natural destructive hurricanes. A driving force for weather and climate. The ocean is essential to life on Earth. It is the primary storehouse of Earth's water. Without the ocean, our planet would be uninhabitable. NASA satellites and their unique use of space are looking to unveil the vast and largely unexplored ocean.
Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that and got a better appreciation using that satellite imagery on the really intrinsic interconnection between climate, rotation, and um, the redistribution of water and current around the globe. So let's keep going here. All right. In this next portion of the lecture, we're going to be basically getting introduced and describing the characteristics of the major oceans on the planet. This is basically an oceanography course compressed into just a few moments. And I certainly can't do each of these the justice that they deserve. Your text does a pretty good job of describing each of these ocean habitats. But I want you to just get a pretty good understanding of each one and how they interconnect and relate. Now, of course, the Pacific is the largest. Um, your text has the numbers here, but it's really hard to wrap our mind around numbers of this scale. 180 million square kilometers of volume in the Pacific. That's just its spatial area. And it includes all of the gulfs and seas that are listed. As we move on, if we look at the Atlantic Ocean, slightly smaller, 106 million square kilometers, and it includes the seas that are listed. Now, interestingly, the Atlantic Ocean was the earliest to get described and mapped, and a lot of attention, a lot of research has been done on its bathymetry, its shape, its depth, a description of it just from a geologic standpoint. But also, it's one of the better studied oceans in terms of fishery. Interesting that it also has one of the bigger populations around it. If you look at the Pacific, um, certainly the larger of the two, and also unique because of its ring of fire, because of those tectonic plates and how they move and slide across each other. The Pacific is surrounded by this kind of girdle of volcanoes that terminate down along the Hawaiian Islands. The Atlantic has the mid Atlantic ridge, which is causing the two tectonic plates to separate. So, if you think about it that way, New York is getting further and further away from London every year by about a half or a quarter of a centimeter, whereas in the Pacific, California is getting closer to Russia, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, the Indian Ocean. Now, this is the smallest of the basins, the smallest of the three oceans, with just under 75 square kilometers. And it includes the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, the Persian, and Red Seas. So much, much warmer, tend to be a little bit higher in salinity, which is the amount of salt in each of those. And in your text, and in pretty much anywhere you're going to go, if you pick up any oceanography text, you're going to see that the ocean is subdivided in much the same way that big lakes are described when we're looking at physical divisions. So when you look at this, you're looking at changes in depth going vertically. You're also looking at horizontal habitat. So any of this area that comes along the land surface is considered benthic. This open water area, what I often refer to as an aquatic desert, both in a lake and a marine environment. This is really what we think about when we think about the ocean or we think about the lake. This is this huge open water habitat. It's usually devoid of life, both in lakes and in oceans. A lot of space, very little life. There's only a few animals in the ocean that can cross this big pelagic zone. You might have your whales, your marlins, your tuna, some of your sharks. The Earth's big fish can cross through here. But for the most part, whether it's an ocean or a lake habitat, most life is going to cling to the edges. Now, we're also going to be diving down in the ocean and looking at these different divisions as we go vertically. In a lake, as well as in a marine environment, these get sorted out very quickly based upon how light can penetrate depth, as well as temperature penetrating depth. And you can have chemical changes that occur from surface to bottom. Now, I'm not going to go into all of that. If you're interested in that, I really encourage you to take my aquatic ecology class. And we focus just on streams and lakes, and we really get into the physics of light and temperature and water chemistry because it all affects the distribution of life from surface to depth. Really, really cool stuff. Now, I really get excited about oceans because we know so little about them compared to freshwater habitat. Our world's oceans have been less explored than the surface of the moon. We know less about the bottom of the oceans on our planet than we know about the surface of both the moon and Mars. I find that fascinating. But if you think about it, the bottom of the Pacific Ocean is a far more hostile environment to us as humans than either the surface of the moon or Mars. It's kind of mind blowing when you think about it, but it is. That's why we know more about an Earth satellite and another planet than we do about the bottom of an ocean on our own planet. To give you some idea, the sense of scale of the world's oceans, I found this really great video. It takes about 6 minutes, almost seven, to get through it, but it takes you on a journey from the surface to depth in the Pacific. And it really helps you wrap your mind around these numbers, the scale of just how immense these habitats are. And it really underscores the bias we have to, my opinion, to terrestrial habitats. When you look at this, when you look at the scale of the depth and the volume of the world's oceans, you really begin to appreciate just what a tiny amount of habitat is really provided on the Earth's surface terrestrially. So I hope you enjoy this. It takes about 7 minutes. And again, I'll step away while you watch. Get it loaded up.
The ocean is really, really deeper. In fact, than most of us realize. If you were to stand on all the land on every continent in the world, the deepest point hit that land from the center of the Pacific is 2 miles deep. 34 somehow, this is already covered in the Let's start with the sea.
So I've seen a lot of videos, and I use this one in my aquatic ecology class. I use this in my fisheries class because I think it's just such a wonderful tool to illustrate just how deep the world's oceans are. Now, you have a question in your homework that deals with why do fish at the bottom of the ocean that never see a photon of light still have eyes compared to fish in cave systems and freshwater environments on the Earth's surface do not have eyes. So I encourage you to think about that. Think about the type of specific biologic adaptations that we know fish have at depth and why that might serve them well to retain their eyes as well as create some unique ways to produce, hint, hint, their own light. So I hope that helps you a little bit with your first homework question. So next, let's stop and think about our thinking. Let's metacognate a little bit, pause and reflect. Make sure you can go back and identify some of the major characteristics of the Earth's oceans. Know the difference between the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian. Okay, so when we look at the ocean, it does have a structure no matter what basin you're in. Scientists have given the ocean basins zones, and each of these zones has a term or a name. So we talked a little bit about this benthic area that hugs the crust of the earth, this open water area known as the pelagic, this upper layer that typically in the ocean goes down about 200 meters is the photic zone. That's the depth to which light from the sun can penetrate. This is super important because most of the photosynthesis on the planet occurs not on land, but in the ocean, and it occurs in that top 200 meters. So if you're like me, I grew up in a landlocked state, in a landlocked county, and I always considered photosynthesis occurring on trees and grasses and other primary producers. Most of the world's primary production occurs in water, not on land, and it's in a very narrow belt. That first 200 meters across the earth is the reason all of us are alive and breathing right now. Okay. And I'll come back to this, but this area is where most of the world's phytoplankton resides. And this is where our oxygen comes from. And there's a wonderful, wonderful video I saved for you at the end of this lecture with a very, very famous oceanographer, and she talks about this. So I don't want to steal too much of her thunder. Now, the neritic zone is from the coast, and it's on this margin of the continental shelf. And then, so that's like right out here. And then you have this open water zone. Now, we also have divisions that go up and down, and that's based on light penetration. So the upper area is photic, this lower area is aphotic. And light and temperature and pressure are the main physical forces at play on most of the planet. Okay. Let me scooch down here a little bit. All right, so let's talk about light a little bit. Light in the ocean. 80% of the sun's energy, those packets of photons, will strike the ocean and get absorbed in the top 30 feet. Now, it can penetrate down to 200 meters, that's about 600 feet, but most of the action is occurring in a very, very narrow belt right at the top of the ocean surface. Very little gets past that. And that leaves 3,400 meters. Now, to get that in feet, multiply by 3, so that's close to 10,000 feet of water are in the dark. Okay, so keep in mind we have animals at the bottom of the ocean that have adapted their entire body surface to produce their own light through bioluminescence. Luminescence. It's absolutely fascinating how they do this. We didn't even know these creatures existed until we developed the technology to take the Alvin and other submersibles way down deep. And researchers were absolutely gobsmacked to find light blinking on and off down there. So these animals at tremendous depth have the ability to manufacture their own light, which is why they have maintained eyes. They still use them, they still need them to hunt, to attract a mate, to lure a mate over. So you can imagine how fascinating it must be for those animals that live in such a dark and cold and pressure laden environment to occasionally see a blue or green or yellowish glimmer as they're swimming around. And it's certainly fascinating for researchers that go down there. Now, it's interesting too, there's only a few people in the world that have been to the bottom of the ocean. In fact, more people have walked on the surface of the moon than have ever been to the ocean's bottom. And one of those individuals who made it to the bottom of the ocean lives locally. His name is Cody Youngbull. He is a PhD aquatics researcher and engineer up at the Flathead Lake Biological Station. And he also has the unusual distinction of being the tallest person to ever make it to the bottom of the ocean. He's something like 6'6" tall. I don't know how they squeezed him into the Alvin, but they got him in there and he went to the bottom of the ocean. So if you're not aware, Flathead Valley has some of the world's greatest researchers in aquatic biology living here. And we're fortunate that we have such a close association with the Flathead Lake Biological Station. So, this is my little plug for them. If you're looking for a great place to extend your learning and education and to pick up a wonderful summer class, can't go wrong by studying at the biostation. So we've talked about light. Let's also talk about temperature and what it does to water in both freshwater and marine environments. So we know sunlight can penetrate, and most of the sun's energy gets absorbed in those upper layers of both fresh and marine water. Now, when light attenuates in lakes, most lakes in the Flathead, it can get down to about 90 feet. Um, Other freshwater lakes don't, the light doesn't go nearly that deep because they're not as clean and as clear as the Flathead. But where light attenuates, where it falls off, water will get very cold compared to the surface. And you get a temperature boundary. And that invisible boundary that we cannot see, but we can certainly feel, is called the thermocline. And it can exist both in the ocean and in fresh water. So in Flathead Lake in the spring, the water temperature is about 4 degrees Celsius from the surface to the bottom. At the deepest point, Mid Lake Deep is about 380 feet deep, straight 4 degrees Celsius, top to bottom. Now, as the Earth rotates and we tip toward the sun and those surface layers start getting way more sunshine, they heat up, and the top of the water can go up to about 20 to 25 degrees Celsius on a really warm day in August. And the water below that stay at around 14 or 15 degrees Celsius. So in between, you get this invisible barrier. Phytoplankton cannot cross it. A lot of fish species either do not like to cross it or they can't, depending on their life stage. So it's a really, really important barrier. Same thing occurs in the ocean. You can imagine at the ocean bottom, a very, very cold environment, very dark, incredibly stable, and never changes. You can imagine you have typhoons and hurricanes raging at the surface, but 10,000 feet down, no change. The temperature stays pretty much the same, always cold, always high pressure, always dark. But as you move toward the surface, even in the ocean, you can get stratification. And your book talks about that and how it can change in the subtropics versus the equator based upon the amount of precipitation that occurs. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so water movement. We've discussed that the rotation of the Earth sets up a Coriolis effect that gets water moving around. Temperature in the atmosphere can also affect that. We know warm air rises, cold air descends, and you add that to a rotating planet, you get current. With current, you get weather pattern and hurricanes and storms, and even just tidal forces can cause water to move back and forth and up and down, and even in massive circular patterns like we see in the tropics during hurricane season. So we also need to pay attention to that the water in the ocean rides currents. I mentioned a little bit earlier about El Nino and El Nina. These are downwellings and upwellings of water that carry nutrition down and they carry nutrition up. And these current patterns, these upwelling and downwelling patterns, are essential to a lot of aquatic life, both in the ocean and in fresh water, because interestingly, that same phenomenon can occur in lakes. When lakes turn over, when that lower level of cool water flips when it gets warmed up and it circulates every spring in Flathead Lake. Anything that died, anything that decayed and went to the bottom of the lake, there's just a layer of yumminess down there. Now, to us, we don't tend to think of rotting fish and guts as being just, woohoo, that's really awesome. But if you are an aquatic plant or animal in Flathead Lake, there's not a lot of food out there. So that turnover of that decaying material from the lake bottom up into the surface, wow, that is your chow time. You live for that. That is what you time your life cycle to capture that availability of nutrition when it pops up each year. Same thing in an ocean environment. If you don't get that, join me in Google Hangouts. We'll talk about it some more. Okay, so we've talked about light, we've talked about temperature. I am going to give you just a very, very brief, broad brush to chemical conditions in salt and freshwater environments. So the first is salt, salinity. Salinity is just a measure of the concentration of salt. You can have salt in fresh water. We more commonly think of it in saltwater environments like the ocean and the sea, and it varies. So if you think, oh, there's salt in the ocean, cool. I want you to begin to understand that salt content varies a great deal in the ocean, at surface, at depth, during periods of circulation and current, upwelling and downwelling. It is not at all constant, and it's really changing right now. We know along the equator where we get more rain than evaporation, salinity tends to be lower. And when you move into the subtropics where it's hot and you get more evaporation than rain, salinity tends to go up. What happens when you add climate change to this? When we are getting more amplitudes in our weather. A lot of people think climate change just means warmer days or warmer weather, but it really is way more complex than that. It means greater amplitudes in weather. So winters can be colder and summers can be harsher. So we start evaporating more water in the summer than we ever have before, which can start increasing salinity levels both in freshwater and in saltwater environments. Crazy, crazy stuff. Okay. So let's take a look. I'll move this up over here for you. A liter of air contains about 200 milliliters of oxygen at sea level. That's typically where this is measured because elevation and altitude can affect concentrations quite a bit. Think about how much oxygen can be stored in water. Okay, a liter of seawater contains a maximum of 9 milliliters of oxygen. So why is that? Well, oxygen concentration in water is heavily dependent upon temperature. Cold water, like the water of Flathead Lake and all of the lakes in Glacier Park, really, really cold water affects the hydrogen and oxygen bond in a water molecule. It opens it up. It can literally, it's like the oxygen molecule gets a hug and more oxygen gets retained. The colder the water, the more oxygen can be held. As water heats up, it releases its oxygen. So that's another thing we're worried about with climate change, because as water's warm, their oxygen levels drop. Okay, so make sure you understand that. Typically, also, pressure has a lot to do with oxygen concentration. So you're going to find a lot more oxygen at the bottom of the ocean than in that mid region, for instance, because that deep, deep water is under greater pressure. It can hold oxygen in. This is why when swimmers put on a scuba tank and they dive to great depth, their body starts packing in all kinds of gases. And if you rise up too soon, that all bubbles out of you. You get the bends, right? So oxygen does well, it's stacking on top of itself with pressure and it bubbles out as it gets under less pressure. All right. So, as promised, I had mentioned to you earlier that we'd be talking about why the world's oceans are so important to life, and that we often think of rainforests and trees and other primary producers being the source of the air we breathe. However, I know several of you have been in my classes before. You've heard me, rant about this and other lectures. But most of our breaths that we take in to inflate our lungs with that precious molecule of oxygen, that oxygen is not manufactured on land. It's not respired by a tree or a blade of grass. It's coming from a small animal that you may have not heard of, a diatom, floating in beds of phytoplankton in the ocean. This is a short 5-minute video. I hope you enjoy it. It explains where our breath comes from.
Seen from space, the blue Earth is standing at the shore. The ocean looks endless and below the surface, the ocean is actually brimming with microscopic plants called phytoplankton. Here I take an empty container and go scoop up water from the shore. In the Coke can, you would have between quarter 75 to 100 million phytoplankton in that Coke can. This invisible forest, phytoplankton, is critical to our formula. Phytoplankton provide the base of green food webs. They also help our planet breathe. Through photosynthesis, phytoplankton generate one half of the oxygen on Earth that all animals, including humans, need to breathe. The blooms of phytoplankton also take carbon dioxide out of the surface waters, making the ocean an important carbon sink. Like plants on land, phytoplankton need sunlight, water, and nutrients to grow. They thrive in surface waters where the sun's rays reach, and their nutrients come from many places. Cold waters carry essential nutrients from the ocean's lower depths to the hungry surface plants. The troids of phytoplankton in the ocean are critical to study. But how do researchers track these invisible triggers? Ships move too slowly for a job this big. So researchers look at global distribution of phytoplankton from space. Over the past decade, scientists have deployed Earth-observing satellites to remotely monitor the color of the ocean. By detecting ocean color from space, satellites monitor the abundance of phytoplankton in the water. The reason that it's so important to study phytoplankton is because it's the only way we can get a perspective of actually what's happening on the entire planet over an entire year, every day, in and out. And by doing this over many years, we can actually see how the Earth is changing natural forces, natural factors, as well as hopefully be able to detect changes that are due to human activity. Phytoplankton respond rapidly to environmental changes. In the past decade, researchers have observed that global levels of phytoplankton tend to decrease as the ocean temperatures warm. During normal physical mixing in the ocean, nutrients come up from the bottom, phytoplankton are fertilized, they grow, the nutrients are depleted, phytoplankton die or are eaten by something else, and the process just continues. Anything that happens that slows down that movement of cold, deep water to the surface would stop the flow of nutrients, which would cause the phytoplankton not to grow as well. And what's happened over the past 10 years that we've been observing the oceans, in large areas of the ocean, they've warmed up. And what that means is the surface water has warmed, and it has essentially put a organic mixing process. As Earth's climate is changing, so is the ocean. Birds, levels of phytoplankton have implications for marine food web. The increased carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere impacts the ocean. The seawater becomes acidic, which threatens marine life. Every part of the Earth is interconnected with the Earth as a system, the whole Earth system. The ocean influences the climate influences the ocean, land influences the ocean. All those pieces are interconnected. It is more important than ever to track changes in the ocean from space, and new tools are helping researchers study the ocean and the phytoplankton that call it home. As Earth's climate continues to change, researchers will refine their tools and keep a close eye on these powerful marine plants from space. Who knew that something so small could provide vital insight into the health of our home planet?
All right, so I hope you have a greater appreciation for the ocean's green machine. Sylvia Earle will be featured in a TED Talk later in this lecture, and she will address the importance of the ocean's phytoplankton as well. Okay, for this next portion in chapter 3, we're looking at specific characteristics of the biology of the oceans. We've talked about this photosynthetic layer, the importance of phytoplankton and zooplankton. And I alluded to this before, but 1/4, 25% of the total photosynthesis that occurs um, is produced in the ocean. Now, if you've been in class with me before, you've heard me mention the next fun fact, but I really do like to underscore this because we do have a land bias, a land or terrestrial centric bias. We tend to think, and often probably this was your experience as you came up through grade school, middle, and high school, you were told that the sun is the source of all life on Earth. It provides the energy that drives photosynthesis, which drives the Krebs cycle, which leads to glycolysis, blah, blah, blah. It is not the only source. And until recently, that statement would have been considered true on any SAT exam. But about 10 years ago, when the Alvin made it to the bottom of the Earth's ocean, a real earth shattering kind of discovery was made that along the bottom of the ocean, there are these vents, and chemosynthesis is occurring there in the complete and utter absence of the sun. Nature finds a way to quote Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park, which I tend to do. Um, Chemosynthesis is this belching of sulfur and all kinds of gases and inorganic molecules from the Earth's crust into this bottom layer of the ocean. And we're only really beginning to appreciate today what an incredibly rich mix, this big, thick, hot, soupy mess is going down in these vent locations at these very specific spots, these hot spots, literal hot spots on the bottom of the ocean are just oozing and spitting out all of this organic and inorganic material that is the basis for life in the absence of the sun. So if I ever throw you a true false question, photosynthesis is responsible for life on the planet. I want you to answer that false. It's just not true. We have chemosynthesis occurring at ocean depth. And this next video is a short one on ocean biodiversity. I'll get that loaded for you here.
It sustains us and is home to more than half of all life on Earth. The presence of the ocean touches every living thing, no matter where it lives. The air we breathe, the water we consume, are ultimately linked to the sea. The ocean drains our and stabilizes our life. Nowhere is more powerful and unforgiving, yet more beautiful and endlessly fascinating. Yet, for too long, we have taken the ocean for granted. Our actions have pushed species to the brink and had an impact on every ocean habitat, no matter how remote or how deep. We haven't understood what the ocean does for us. The effects of climate change have been softened by the ocean, but now we are facing the consequences. The seas are warming, rising, becoming more acidic. It's a sobering thought that coral reefs may be lost within the next century. We all need a healthy ocean, so we must change our ways. Together with the right management, we can repopulate the seas, which will reduce marine pollution and minimize the impact of ocean acidification. The ocean's power of regeneration is remarkable if we just offer it the chance. It's not too late. We are in need of a whole new relationship with the ocean, a wiser, more sustainable relationship. The choice lies with us.
So I don't know about you, but I love David Attenborough. I have since I was a young child. I honestly think I could listen to that man just read his grocery list. But there's something about him. He can convey this really serious information and do it in a way that is approachable. So you'll find I use a lot of David Attenborough in my lectures. Moving on as we go through, um, that short video touched on several concepts that are in the latter portion of chapter 3. And this is where I always feel like a Debbie Downer in a lecture. Human influences. We are really a problem on the planet, aren't we? Um, we are filling the ocean with plastic. Most of the world's big fish are not there anymore. We've overfished them. We now have the ability to drill on the ocean bottom. And all of these factors combined with um, our diet, interestingly, are reliant on animal proteins, has that in addition to industry and automation. led to big spikes in climate change. Your book does a pretty good job discussing some of the causality of that. We're looking into marine habitats from this point on. We've looked at freshwater, we've looked at saltwater, we've looked at the hydrologic cycle, ocean currents, weather patterns, and even where we get our oxygen from. Now we want to talk in the latter portion of this lecture about the major freshwater and marine habitats. So I'll scooch this up over here. Your text does a great job. I don't want to read you a bunch of stuff that's already in your text. I do kind of want to emphasize these habitats. My fear is if you're in a landlocked state, you haven't heard about reefs, you haven't heard about atolls and lagoons, you might just breeze over that. Or maybe you'll find them really fascinating as I do and want to camp out on those paragraphs, but I want to give them some attention. Now, what's really fascinating to me is so much of what we know about structures in the ocean, island formation, formation of atolls, lagoons, barrier reefs, so much of this that we kind of take for granted because it's in every textbook today came as a result of the space program. When we were able to get satellites into space, space stations into space, and we could start photographing our planet for the first time, we got a bird's eye view, literally, of these structures. And scientists, oceanographers, and geologists were able to combine their expertise to determine how these structures arose. So within ocean reefs, we have three different categories. You have a fringing reef. That's a reef that just developed offshore. They tend to hug the edge of a continent. You have barrier reefs. The most famous, of course, is the one around Australia. They stand between the open sea and a lagoon or an entire continent, like they do in Australia. You have coral atolls, and those are the ones that were the real head scratchers for geologists for a long time. You'd have this formation, this structure out in the middle of the ocean, and people are like, where did that come from? So, you know, if you were just to see this from space and you didn't understand geology, this is a real oddball out in the ocean. Where does that land come from? Where does that structure come from? So typically, you have island formation in the middle of the oceans due to land passing over tectonic plates, forming volcanoes, and over time, those volcanoes may erode or blow their top and disappear. And then what's left behind is that structure, that little edge, that ring of atoll on the edge. The other structure that's not made of coral, not made of rock, is made of kelp. If you've never seen video footage of kelp beds, they're fascinating. It's like an underwater rainforest. They're huge. They can grow to incredible height, incredible density, and they provide structure for many, many animals, both to live or for sea lions. It's cover habitat where they can hide and sneak and, sneak up on prey items. It's amazing. They're very similar to our terrestrial forests, and they even have a canopy at the water surface. So not only are they providing oxygen just bubbling up through the water, but they have this canopy effect at the top where they darken. They block out the sun, so they change light penetration. So if you're a little fish and you are looking to hide, that kelp forest is really critical habitat for you. Cool stuff. Okay, so what about shallow marine waters? So, as I mentioned before, we tend to think of the ocean as being that huge open water expanse, and of course it is. But as biologists and ecologists, the life that's occurring in the ocean is not occurring out there. Remember, that's the aquatic desert. The huge amount of biomass and biodiversity is in shallow marine waters. This is where you have your coral beds. This is where you have these amazing schools of fish, all the color, all the life, all of the interactions, all of the ecology is occurring in a very shallow margin of life in the world's oceans. Now, most of this life, especially for fish, is determined by temperature. I often tell my students if you go home and you go to work for your tribe or for an environmental agency in your hometown and you can only afford one piece of equipment in working in an aquatic habitat, get the very best water temperature device money can buy. Water temperature will tell you more about aquatic health and health not only physically, but also chemically of any other device you could take. Um, I often tend to think of it, if you're a parent and you have a young child, if your child gets sick, the first thing you want to do is take their temperature. Aquatic environments are exactly the same. When they begin to experience upset, when they begin to experience negative effects, either due to pollution or climate change, the temperature changes. And tracking that temperature is one of the absolute best ways to assess aquatic health. So, what controls temperature? Well, climate, current, depth, pressure, all these things can affect temperature, but also kelp beds. Kelp beds are producing oxygen. Oxygen can get stored with colder water. So, temperature, oxygen, sunlight, they all tend to go together in these shallow marine environments. What about the shoreline? So, if you take restoration ecology or zoology with me, you're going to hear me talk a lot about marine shorelines. These are the absolute most hostile habitats on the planet. I've asked this question of students in the past, and I wish I could be with you in person and hear your answers today. A lot of times, students, and I think I said the same thing when I was at your stage in your academic career. I always thought deserts would be the most hostile environment to live in. All the sun, lack of water, it's these marine shorelines. Now imagine that you're a barnacle or a sea urchin or a starfish. You're getting pounded every single moment of your life by wave action. Not only that, but those waves can come up with the tide and go down and out with the tide. Make sure you watch the Bay of Fundy play pause it video after this lecture to learn more about that. So that means not only are you getting pounded physically, you're also being subjected to atmospheric oxygen that you're not adapted to breathe in, periods of dewatering, incredible vulnerability to predators. So, these marine shorelines are some of the most hostile environments to live in. And as a result, they're some of the hotbeds for adaptation and biodiversity. Crazy, crazy stuff. If you haven't ever had a chance to walk in a tide pool area on a coastline. I encourage you, field trip when this coronavirus thing is done, hop in a car, truck, take a field trip, see these environments. They're incredible. Okay, so water movement is the absolute most important factor in these habitats. It provides nutrition, it provides food, it takes away waste products, but it also brings in predators. It takes away cover when the tide goes out. It adds cover when the tide comes in. Plus, just the daily hammering on the body surface that occurs in these intertidal zones. Now, think about that. Most of the life that lives there lacks a skeleton. And that's why, if you're an invertebrate like a starfish or a sea urchin, you do not have an internal skeleton getting hammered by wave action. You're kind of squishy. And that squishiness is what allows you to live there quite well. Now, tide action is not the same everywhere. In some areas on the planet, tides can come into an incredible height and go out to an incredible length, exposing huge amounts of beaches. Again, watch the Bay of Fundy video. In other areas, that amplitude just is not that exaggerated. And the animals that live in these zones are specifically adapted to the degree of change that their bodies and their ecologic interconnectedness has to sustain each day of their life. So this is straight out of your text, a very, very classic graphic that shows how life can be distributed along a shoreline in a marine intertidal area. Now you have some organisms that cannot handle very much dewatering at all. They're always going to be in this bottom layer. You have some barnacles that can hang out in these really dynamic habitats, and they handle that very, very well. It's because of a concept in ecology we call differential tolerance. Some organisms are highly specific, they can handle no variability whatsoever. Others, pretty chill. They can handle a huge, huge amplitude in wave action, tidal action, temperature, and even food availability. Okay, I always feel like this next group of aquatic habitats is like everybody's redheaded stepchild. And if you are redheaded, I'm not picking on you right now. But this is the group that is so important to so many species, and it just does not get the attention I feel it deserves. And this group that includes estuaries, salt marshes, and mangrove forests. Now, one of the reasons people don't like these habitats is they usually stink. I mean, quite honestly, they smell badly. Things rot here, they decompose here. You get lots of sulfur, that rotten egg smell that you don't like. That's what these areas smell like. They tend to be backwater habitats. The water doesn't move much. As a result, it's not pretty. You tend to have black or brown water. It's soupy. Think about where crocodiles and mosquitoes live. And that's the type of environment we're talking about. So that might explain why they get drained. It might explain why they get diverted, but it doesn't underscore how important they are. Think about it. If you are an ocean going salmon and it is time for you to make your spawning run back home, the only way you can convert your entire body system from a saltwater to a freshwater environment is hanging out in saltwater estuaries. Unfortunately, these habitats are being drained at a remarkably fast rate worldwide. And as a result, fish cannot make the biochemical transition they have to make in order to have a successful spawning run. This is also the habitat that collects all of the terrestrial runoff, all of that spring runoff coming out of the Rockies, making its way to the Pacific coast, carrying nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur. It ends up in estuaries where it gets cooked and broken down and made bioavailable to phytoplankton and zooplankton and young fish. However, if we drain those ecosystems, that grocery store, that buffet of food just simply is not available. And it's one of the reasons we're losing a lot of the fish in the ocean. The same thing goes for salt marshes and mangroves. People like to live on coastlines, they like beautiful views of water. And a salt marsh may or may not be your cup of tea. And in many places, especially in the southeast, these habitats have been drained. If you take my eco restoration class, we'll talk some more about that. All right. So your book has some great photos. If you have not seen these habitats, I encourage you to look them up on Google Images. I've done research in salt marshes in North Carolina and Virginia along the Chesapeake Bay. One of the most biodiverse, rich habitats that we still have in North America. If you're a birder, if you like to see huge flocks of birds coming in and doing what they do, salt marshes are where you want to be. Major bird fly paths typically occur over salt marshes because of just the amazing amount of food that is there. This also acts as a kidney for continents. Salt marshes receive all of the runoff coming off of the continental plate and they bioprocess it into a form that is not as deleterious. So Just as the human kidney takes our food and our waste products and filters it out of the body, salt marshes and wetlands do the same thing. If we continue to drain them and develop them, we're losing a key part of the continent's anatomy. If you want to think of this in terms of human anatomy, salt marshes and mangroves are the kidney and the liver, and we're draining them. And this just shows an image. There's several, and I again don't like to be Debbie Downer on these things, but we're losing our marshlands, and with that, we're losing the ability to entrain carbon from the atmosphere terrestrially. A lot of carbon in the world gets sucked up into the world's oceans. If carbon is generated over land, the best way to trap it is in marshlands and wetlands. So, for that reason, the Blackfeet tribe up around Glacier National Park is working very hard today to restore the incredibly complex web of wetlands that once ringed Glacier National Park. We're worried that we're losing the glaciers. We're worried that the carbon that's being stored up at high elevation areas that's causing the melt is going so rapidly that it cannot be ameliorated. Well, construction, reconstruction, and restoration of wetlands is one very powerful tool in the fight to keep glaciers in the high country, and the Blackfeet are leading the way. So if you want to learn more about that, just Google Blackfeet and wetland restoration, and you'll see the coverage. What I would like to end with in today's lecture is someone that is just a personal hero of mine. I have admired this woman as a researcher for many years. Um, when I was coming up as an undergraduate, there were not many female scientists in my textbooks or talked about in my classroom, and there certainly were not any female professors. Um, when I learned about Sylvia Earle and the important work that she's doing in the world's oceans, I found that I just really admired her for her scholarship, for her statesmanship, and for her ability to take an incredibly complex topic, the biology of the world's oceans, and communicate that complexity in a way that everyone can understand. So I'll finish today's lecture. I do encourage you to watch the full 18 minutes of video. She's an easy person to listen to, and I think you'll come away as I have, inspired by what she has to share. So until our next lecture, I'll finish off with Sylvia Earle. Be sure to contact me if you have any questions on this or any other lectures.
Not, not imagine that we could do it seemed at that time, but now we know. I want to share with you changes in the matters that in 50 years diversity in the sea. When you should care that disappear, when mysterious but it really should concern you. I'm haunted by the thought of what tomorrow is child, asking the living ocean, now is that time. I hope for your help to explore, protect, and in some way secure hope for humankind. Thus to the ocean means both for us. I hope you engage earthworms and someday evidence that there is for me as a scientist, it all began in 1953 when I first tried scuba. It's when I first I actually love diving at night. You see a lot of fish diving day and night. It's really easy when you're living underwater most of the time. At the same time that astronauts were putting their footprints on the moon. In 1979, while using this 6 miles offshore, it's one of my favorite movies. Since then, I used about 100 times of non design and build systems to actually succeed. I made a 5-year national sustainable using stars. It's so simple to drive. Astronauts and astronauts alike really appreciate what is the things you need in space or under the sea. I heard astronauts say how he had to learn everything he could about life support, but in theory, everything he could to take care of his ancestors. And then he pointed to this life support system. You need to learn everything you can about it. The poet Organ said, thousands of years, none without water. 97% of this water is not blue. If you think the ocean is important, imagine Earth without it. Mars comes to mind. No ocean, no life support system. I gave a talk not so long ago at the World Bank, and I showed this amazing image of Earth. Here it is, the World Bank. That's where all the assets are. We've been drawing them down much faster than the natural systems can replenish. So Earth says the economy is a whole lot secure with the environment. With every drop of water we drink, every breath we take, you're connected to the sea, no matter where on Earth you live. Most of the oxygen in the atmosphere is generated by food. Over time, most of the planet's organic carbon has been absorbed and stored here, mostly by microbes. The ocean drives planet another stabilized chemistry, shapes Earth's chemistry. Water from the sea forms clouds that we form from the land and the sea as well, and provides home for about 97% of life in the world, maybe the universe. No water, no life. No blue, no green. Yet we have this idea, we humans, that the Earth, all of it, the oceans, the skies, is so vast, so resilient, it doesn't matter what we put in it. That may have been true 10,000 years ago, and maybe 1,000 years ago. But in the last 100, especially the last 50, we've drawn down the assets, the air, the water, the wildlife, that make our lives possible. New technologies have helped us to understand the nature of nature, the nature of what's happening, showing us our impact on the earth. Well, first you have to know that you've got a problem. And fortunately, in our time, we know about the problems that have all preceding history. And with knowing comes caring. With caring, there's hope that we can find a place for ourselves within the natural systems that support us. But first, we have to know. 2 years ago, I met John Hankey, who's the head of Google Earth, and I told him how much I love being able to hold the world in my hands and go exploring vicariously. I asked him, when are you going to finish it? He did a great job of the land, the earth. What about the water? Since then, I had the great pleasure of working with the Googlers, with Julia Marine, with the National in Earth. And as of just this week, last Monday, Google Earth is now whole. Consider this, starting right here at the convention center. We can find the nearby aquarium, we can look at where we're sitting, and then cruise up the coast to the big aquarium, the ocean. In California, there's 4 national marine sanctuaries and a new network of state marine reserves that are beginning to protect and restore some of the assets. We can fleet over to Hawaii and see the real Hawaiian Islands, not just the little bit of the surface. Also, what's below the sea. Wait a minute, we can go splash, right there, under the ocean and see what the whales see. We can go explore the other side of the Hawaiian Islands. We can go actually and swim around on Google Earth and visit with humpback whales. These are genuine whales that I've had the pleasure of meeting face to face many times over the world. There's nothing quite like being personally inspected by a whale. We can pick up and fly to the deepest place, 40 miles down the Mariana Trench, where only 2 people have ever been. Imagine that. It's only 7 miles, but only 2 people have been there 49 years ago. One-way trips are easy. We need new deep-diving submarines. How about some X-prizes for ocean exploration? We need to see deep trenches, the undersea mountains, and understand life in the deep sea. We can now go to the Arctic. Just 10 years ago, I stood on the ice at the North Pole. The ice-free Arctic Ocean may happen in this century. That's bad news for the polar bears. It's bad news for us too. Excess carbon dioxide is not only driving global warming, it's also changing ocean chemistry, making the sea more acidic. It's bad news for coral reefs and oxygen plankton, also bad news for us. We're putting hundreds of millions of tons of plastic and other trash into the sea, millions of tons of carbon fishing nets. Europe continues to kill. We're clogging the ocean, poisoning the planet's circulatory system, and we're taking out hundreds of millions of tons of wildlife, all carbon-based units. Organically, we're killing sharks for plankton soup, undermining food chains that shape planetary chemistry, via the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the oxygen cycle, the water cycle, and life support system. Incredibly, we're still killing bluefin tuna, truly endangered, and much more valuable alive than dead. All of these parts are part of our life support system. We kill using long lines with baited hooks that can now stretch for 50 miles or more. Industrial trawlers and draggers are scraping the sea floor like bulldozers, taking everything in their path. Using Google Earth, you can witness trawlers in China, the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, shaking the foundation of our life support system, leaving millions of death on the path. Next time you dine on sushi or sashimi or swordfish steak or shrimp cocktail or whatever wildlife you happen to enjoy from the ocean, think of the real cost. For every pound that goes to market, more than 10 pounds, even 100 pounds, may be thrown away as bycatch. This is the consequence of not knowing the limits of what we can take out of the sea. This chart shows the decline in ocean wildlife from 1900 to 2000, the highest concentration are in red. In my lifetime, imagine 90% of the big fish have been killed. Most of the turtles, sharks, tunas, and whales are way down in numbers. But there is good news. 10% of the big fish still remain. There's still some blue whales. There's still some krill in Antarctica. And a few oysters in Chesapeake Bay. That's the coral reefs are still in pretty good shape and not dull around the middle of the planet. Still coming, but not a lot to turn things around. But business as usual means that in 50 years there may be no coral reefs and no commercial fishing because the fish would simply be gone. Imagine the ocean without fish. Imagine what that means for our life support. Natural systems on the land are in big trouble too. The problems are more obvious, and some actions are being taken to protect trees, watersheds, wildlife. In 1872, with Yellowstone National Park, the United States began establishing a system of parks. But some say it's the best idea never happened. About 12% of the land around the world is now protected, safeguarding biodiversity, providing a carbon sink, generating oxygen, protecting watersheds. In 1972, this nation began to establish a counterpart in the sea, national marine sanctuaries. It's another great idea. The good news is that there now are more than 4,000 places in the sea around the world that have some kind of protection, and you can find them on Google Earth. The bad news is that you have to look hard to find them. In the last 3 years, for example, the U.S. protected 330,000 square miles of ocean as national monuments, but it only increased from 0.6 of 1% to 0.8 of 1% of the ocean globally. Protected areas do rebound, but it takes a long time to restore 50-year-old rockfish or monkfish, sharks, sea bass, or 200-year-old orange. We don't consume 200-year-old cows or chickens. Protected areas provide hope, but the creatures of Ed Wilson's dream of an encyclopedia of life, or the census of marine life, will live not just as a list, photograph, and a paragraph. The scientists around the world have been looking at the 99% of the ocean open to fishing and mining and drilling and dumping and whatever, to search out hope spots and try to find ways to give them and us a secure future. Such as the Arctic, we have one chance right now to get it right. Or the Antarctic, where the continent is protected, but the surrounding ocean is being stripped of its krill, whales, fish. Sargasso Sea's 3 million square miles of cleared forest has been gathered up to feed cows. 97% of the land in the bottomless islands is protected, but the adjacent sea is being ravaged by fishing. It's true too in Argentina and the Patagonian shelf, now in serious trouble. The high seas with whales, tunas, and dolphins found the largest, least protected ecosystem on Earth, filled with numerous creatures living in dark waters that average 2 miles deep. Flesh is white with oil, their own living creatures. There's still places in the sea as pristine as I knew as a child. The next 10 years may be the most important in the next 10,000 years. The best chance our species will have to protect what remains of the natural systems give us life. To cope with climate change, we need new ways to generate power. We need new ways, better ways to cope with poverty, wars, and disease. We need many things to keep and maintain the world as a better place. But nothing else will matter if we fail to protect the ocean. Our faith in the ocean. We need to do for the ocean what our Lord did for the skies above. A global plan of action through the World Conservation Union, the UNCM, is underway to protect biodiversity, to mitigate and recover from the impacts of climate change. On high seas and in coastal areas, wherever we can identify critical places. New technologies are needed to map, photograph, and explore the 95% of the ocean that we have yet to see. The goal is to protect biodiversity, provide stability and resilience. We need deep diving science, new technologies to explore the ocean. We need maybe an expedition, a TED at sea, that could help figure out next steps. And so, I suppose you want to know what my wish is. I wish you would use all means at your disposal. Forums, expeditions, the web, new submarines, a campaign to ignite public support for a global network of marine protected areas. Large enough to save and restore the ocean, a blue heart of the planet. How much? Some say 10%, some say 30%. You criminal and help ensure his survival. But what actually is, as it turns out, my favorite species, LPDS. For the children of today, for tomorrow's child is never again. Now is the time. Thank you.
So if you've never heard Sylvia Earle, I hope you enjoyed that. For those who've been in my wildlife and fisheries class, my zoology class, really any class I teach, this is a repeat. But she's important, and you should know about her, and you should know about her work. Um, all right, that's the end of lecture 2, the end of our content for chapters 1 through 3. Based on this content plus the reading materials that are uploaded in Schoology, you should be ready for your first assignment. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to give me a call, email, or join me in Google Hangouts. Remember, you need to have the Google Calendar app on your phone to do that, or on your laptop, and click on the link that's there. I'll also send everyone an email about that. So take care, have a great week, and I'll see you in lecture 3.